I'll get started while Jordan's passing out some things. So today we're going to talk to you about casein modification by ultrasound technology. So first of all, we're going to give you a little bit of background about casein, a little bit of background about ultrasonication, and then we'll jump into the papers that we chose. So as we all know, casein is one of the major milk protein fractions. It has a very open and flexible structure because it's highly random coil. It's a random coil protein. And based on how it's isolated and extracted from the milk, we can create a variety of casein ingredients. And these two we are going to talk about in our papers today. So sodium caseinate and micellar casein. So sodium, here you go.
Okay, so different ingredient or like foods that you can use casein in, like nutritional beverages, baked goods, cheese, and then meat products. So we have cheese and meat that we'll pass around for you guys to try.
Yes. So these two ingredients are processed quite differently. Sodium caseinate undergoes much harsher conditions. So it's precipitated by acid, and then they add NaOH to replace the calcium ions with sodium ions, and then it's dried down into a powder. And then micellar casein is made by microfiltration and diafiltration of skim milk, and then it's dried down into a powder. So based on how they're processed, they have different chemical compositions and different functionalities. So micellar casein has much higher ash content, whereas sodium caseinate is a more concentrated source of protein. And then on the table on the right, you'll see the functionality comparison. So sodium caseinate is a really good emulsifier, where micellar casein is not so good at that. But they also have similar solubility, which is pretty good, and heat stability at neutral pH. But the two functional properties that we're going to talk to you today about are gelation, something that casein does not readily do, and then emulsification, something that casein is really good at. A little background on ultrasonication. So first of all, sonication is when you apply sound energy to a system to agitate particles, and in our case that would be protein structure. It would physically modify the protein structure. So in a liquid system, this would mean forming micro bubbles via cavitation, and then the bubbles collapse and create turbulence in the water, or in the system I should say, disrupting the protein structure. So this ultrasonication is used a little bit in the food industry already for a variety of needs, especially for creating nanoemulsions, but it's yet to be used as a method for physically modifying proteins. But the goal is that through ultrasonication, the protein structure would be disrupted somewhat, the proteins would be opened up, exposing more hydrophobic groups and expanding its functional properties. Alright, now I will start with the paper that I looked at, which is the influence of ultrasound on chemically induced gelation of micellar casein systems. And just one note before I start, the paper is about chemical gelation rather than enzymatic coagulation or heat coagulation. The authors mentioned that they avoided these techniques because they knew that enzyme activity would be affected by sonication, and also casein is very stable to heat, so rather they induced gelation with a chemical. So the reason why they looked at sonicating casein was because they found beneficial properties when they applied it to milk, like an entire system, and then isolated whey protein. So it improved gel strength, it decreased gel syneresis, and then it also sped up the cheese making process a little bit. So the goals of this paper were to isolate casein to see how ultrasound would affect casein gelation in an isolated system. So the paper had two main experimental schemes, and they just vary in the steps of the process. So they both started by dispersing the micellar casein in water, and then the first method sonicated it, and then they added tetrasodium pyrophosphate, which is an emulsifying salt, or TSPP. And so this is a GRAS-approved food ingredient that's it's used in like processed cheese, or I saw that it was like in different meat batters and things like that. So it is in use a little bit. Whereas the second method they added the TSPP, and then they sonicated the aqueous protein solution, and then they left it to gel, and finally they analyzed the gel. And here are the specific methods they used to analyze the gel. We're just going to look at the first four because they're most relevant to what we've talked about in class. So first of all, they looked at surface hydrophobicity using a fluorometric assay using the ANS probe method. They also measured surface charge with a zetasizer. They looked at gel strength via a texture analyzer and a compression test. And then they looked at gel syneresis by a centrifugation method. So jumping into the results, we're going to start with surface hydrophobicity. Oh, there you go. And so the darkest bars are the just a sonicated aqueous protein system without the TSPP, and then the other two bars are the two different methods that I described. And so they see an increase in surface hydrophobicity as you increase sonication time, and surface hydrophobicity was highest for the systems that were sonicated and then had TSPP added. And then looking at surface charge, so the systems without TSPP had much higher surface charge, which makes sense because how tetrasodium pyrophosphate works is that it complexes with the calcium. And so when it does this, it reduces like the charge load on the protein. And so the systems where TSPP was present, the surface charge was much lower because it was complexed. Next, looking at gel strength. So they found that gel strength increased with sonication, but after 10 minutes of sonication, there wasn't a significant improvement. And then they also found that the systems that were sonicated before tetrasodium pyrophosphate was added produced stronger gels, and that's that top line up here. Next, looking at gel syneresis, which gives these pictures, I think, help a lot. So the figure A is the sonicated and then TSPP addition, and so that method created a much more uniform and cohesive gel, whereas the ones that were sonicated after TSPP was added created much weaker and lumpier gels. And they also expelled a lot more water, so these points here that go up show the sonication after TSPP. So overall, what this paper found was that sonicating those solutions prior to adding the gelling agent was beneficial to the gel characteristics. And the authors mentioned that there is a synergistic effect of adding TSPP. So I do have some critiques of this paper. They didn't include a non-sonicated control when they measured gel strength, which makes it really difficult to see if sonication even had an effect on gel strength as alone. Also, like in Sonia's paper, they didn't measure surface hydrophobicity. Well, they measured it correctly, but they didn't calculate the value full out, so we can't compare how this protein's surface hydrophobicity was to other proteins very easily. Also, I think it would be interesting to see how ultrasonicating proteins affects gelation without TSPP, like if you're just to induce gelation with acid, like in a yogurt system or something, because right now food companies aren't really wanting to add a chemical like tetrasodium pyrophosphate to the label, so that's not something that I would investigate. As far as feasibility, I think it'd be very difficult to implement this, mainly because casein doesn't readily gel and the benefits of sonication were pretty marginal. And there's already ingredients that gel very well, and so I think this would just, it just requires a lot more energy and cost associated with this technology for not a lot of benefit. But if you were to use this type of technology in a food system, you could create it like a yogurt with a firmer texture or with reduced syneresis, so that might be a possible application. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jordan.
Alright, so the paper that I looked at was entitled Structural and Emulsifying Properties of Sodium Caseinate and Lactoferrin Influenced by Ultrasound Process. So we're not going to look at the lactoferrin portion of this since it is such a small portion of the whey protein. So we focus mainly on the sodium caseinate. So like Claire's, mine looked at sonicating the casein as well, except mine is sodium caseinate instead of the micellar casein. So by having our papers look at different structured of the casein and then looking at gelation versus emulsification, we kind of got a broader sense of how the sonication affects the structure and function of the casein. All right, so why look at sodium caseinate? So there have been previous studies that have found the benefits of sonication of soy, egg, and whey proteins. Some of the benefits are increased surface hydrophobicity, decreased particle size, and then an increased solubility. But there's minimal research done on casein and sonication, then even less on sodium caseinate. So the objective of our study was to understand the effects of ultrasound on sodium caseinate, and they looked at emulsion droplet size, emulsion activity, creaming index, and then emulsion stability. So this here is an example of the droplet size. So here you can see a lot bigger droplets and then a lot smaller droplets. And then this is an example of the creaming index. So to measure the cream, you take the height of the cream over the height of the total emulsion, and then times 100 to give you that percentage. Okay, so this method is to find, or to get the sonicated protein solution. So first, they started with the protein dispersed in the ultra-pure water, and then the pH was adjusted to 7.0 using 1 molar sodium hydroxide. And then the solution was homogenized with a rotor stator, and then it was sonicated for 2, 4, or 6 minutes. So after they did this, they looked at the protein size distribution and zeta potential using the zeta sizer nanoseries, molecular weight distribution of the treated proteins and untreated proteins using the native page and SDS page, viscosity using the rheometer, surface hydrophobicity using the anionic fluorescence probe, and then the differences in the secondary structure using the far UV circular dichroism. All right, so important to point out here that this ultrasound-treated protein solution is what we just got from the previous methods. This non-treated did not go through that step. So for the coarse emulsions, can't stand over there. So we had, for this non-treated, we had 70 milliliters of the non-treated protein solution, and then 30 milliliters of sunflower oil that was added to it, and then it was homogenized using the rotor-stator. Whereas here we took the protein ultrasonicated solution that we got from the previous method and did the same thing. So we added 30 milliliters of the sunflower oil and then homogenized it using the rotor-stator. And then additionally they did a fine emulsion from the non-treated, and that's where they would sonicate it. Okay, and then they looked at the creaming index. So that was using the same equation I showed you on the previous slides. Emulsion activity, and that was calculated using this equation. Emulsion stability using this equation. The emulsion activity was, so they centrifuged it to get the emulsion activity, and then they kind of did the same thing for emulsion stability, except they heated it, cooled it, and then centrifuged it. And then the droplet size distribution using late scattering method. Oh, I can use this. Okay, so the native page showed no differences, as you can see here. And then the SDS page also showed no differences, but they should have used a urea page instead of the SDS page, since SDS page only separates based on size, whereas urea page separates on size and charge. So we kind of would have got maybe different results if they would have used that, or seen better results. And then the surface hydrophobicity increased with an increase in sonication time. Oops. So as you can see here, the control versus the 6 minutes, there was an increase in the surface hydrophobicity. And then that shows us that the protein was kind of broken down more, and then more hydrophobic groups were exposed. And then increasing the sonication time decreased the droplet size. So if you look at the droplet size in the 0 minutes versus 6 minutes, there's a big difference. And then the shorter sonication time led to a bimodal distribution of size. So this will tell us that there's 2 distinct sizes of droplets versus 1 distinct droplet size as in the 6 minutes. There was a significant reduction in pH, as shown here. There was no significant difference in zeta potential, and then there was a significant reduction in the protein diameter, which I talked about on the last slide. Okay, so comparing the fine to the coarse emulsions, there was a gradual increase in the emulsion stability with the fine emulsion. So as you can see, the stability goes up even with an increase of sonication time. Whereas in the coarse emulsion, there was an increase, but it did not change with the sonication time. So the conclusions of the paper, they concluded that sonicating sodium caseinate improved emulsions by increasing the surface hydrophobicity, decreasing particle size, and then increasing the emulsion stability. So some of the critiques are that, again, they should use urea page instead of SDS page. They could have chosen a different protein since caseinate's already a good emulsifier. They could have looked at hydrophobic lipophilic balance, which will tell you if you have a good emulsion. And then they could have compared the same emulsion. So instead of comparing a fine to a coarse emulsion, comparing a fine to a fine or a coarse to a coarse. And then feasibility. So it's difficult to implement industrially, especially since casein's already a good emulsifier. With the increased energy requirements, it's just not worth it. And then you could use this with a poor quality meat to make a better sausage. Oh, I do have to point out the cow too. You can't have a presentation for me without the cow. Okay. So overall connections to the class. So both papers found that ultrasound treatment modified casein surface hydrophobicity, and then sonication showed more pronounced improvements in the emulsion preparation. So casein is difficult to modify by this method since it is already an open structure. And then, so sonication's better for forming the emulsions, not modifying the casein. And then this could be applied to a globular protein to enhance functionality. Any questions, comments, or? Because we like pineapple. We saw a lot of mistakes in this paper. That should not be talked about. They also said that the creaming index went up with an increased emulsion stability. Yeah, I think they were just confused. Mhm. Yeah. 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 No, they didn't specify.
Well, I think because it's the goal with the extraction process is to keep it as native as possible, and so if your subunits are still kind of associated in that micelle structure, they wouldn't be like open and available to expose, like to orient their hydrophobic domains and hydrophilic domains to the appropriate phase. No, they didn't really. They didn't connect it very well with like an application. I'm even thinking now whether like, so if you were making yogurt, it would be acidified by the cultures that are producing acid. Well, sonication I feel like would impact how the microbes grow. So I don't even know if that would be possible. I don't know if that answers your question, but that poses another question. No, it just seemed like, because they're like, well, we didn't look at heat coagulation because it's heat stable, and enzymes are affected by ultrasonication, so we're going to chemically induce a gel. And I was like, that doesn't, at least for a food application, that doesn't seem reasonable, especially with like the whole clean label kick.
Because it would separate, because the casein particles are so close in size that the SDS page would not like separate them as well as your pH because it's an added charge separation. Yeah. So I mean, even for I think it would probably be due to the homogenation because in the second, this 2 column, it's still wider and that's still not ultrasound treated. So the only similarity between all of them would be the homogenation. So that would be my guess, yeah. Yep, so it's just the rotor stator stirred case, the stirred solution. So And the stirring would do that too, right? Like the rotor stator homogenation. I'm not I don't think they added that in there. Yeah.
By the way, I graded your exams. Do you want them? Do you really want them? So, the average was very similar to last time, 1 point greater than last time. However, we didn't get the 103 this time. The highest was 89. Do you want them?
What's their other choice?
The other choice? I keep them.
Well, the lowest one.
Huh?
At least the lowest one.
The lowest one up, yeah. That's a positive way of thinking about it.
I try to be more positive. This literally makes a big change in my life. I'm like, well, look at it this way. That's a huge change, right? What was it last time? Like,
Oh no, your science.
I'm trying.
I didn't even look. I was like, that looks like my handwriting.
Don't cry.
Okay, I think you want to go back and look at the key, but the second question threw many of you off. The enzymes question. Yeah, the enzyme, when I say parameters, it's Km and Vmax. These are the parameters, the kinetic parameters. Surprise, yes. Yeah, so when you don't get the second question right, you will not get the third question right. I tried to give some partial grades just because I felt bad. So, yeah, so I was really generous, otherwise 61 won't be the lowest grade if I didn't do that. So, yeah. Maybe one of you got it correct. I can't remember who. But. Okay. Huh? Okay. All right. So for the final, Joanne laughs. For the final, it's cumulative, but you want to think about the whole picture of the class rather than focus on details from the earlier lectures. How would the earlier lecture lead us all the way to protein modification? So putting the pieces of the puzzle together, basically. So broaden your minds. You know who says that, right? Harry Potter, the character you were for Halloween. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So where is my cursor? Let's continue where we left off. Wasn't here. What happened? It went out of presentation mode. Went all the way. Okay. So we were talking, we stopped when we were talking about the different enzymatic hydrolysis and how it would impact the profile of the peptides generated, and then therefore the functionality and bioactivity. So the way we control hydrolysis, we can do that in multiple ways. But first of all, when we talk about control of proteolysis, one of the things we control is the degree of hydrolysis. The degree of hydrolysis is defined as the percentage of total peptide bonds broken compared to the original native protein. So this will give you a degree of hydrolysis in a percentage term. And we talked last time is that we want to maintain a limited degree of hydrolysis, otherwise the protein becomes less functional. If a degree of hydrolysis is way high, protein, for example, will not gel, will not emulsify. And if it emulsify, it won't be stable for a long time. So we don't want high degree of hydrolysis because of loss in functionality, and also because of what did we talk about as well, if you really have a high degree of hydrolysis. Bitter. Mostly you will release peptides that would be, some of them would be hydrophobic, and hydrophobic peptides tend to be bitter. So the more you break down the protein, you are going to release some hydrophobic peptides. So you might say, but not all enzymes will release hydrophobic peptides. That's true, but the more you hydrolyze, you are tending to release peptides that are hydrophobic, given the fact that there are hydrophobic residues in the protein anyway. So when you denature that protein by chopping it off and breaking it into small peptides, it is more likely that you will have a high perception of bitterness. So one way of controlling proteolysis is limiting the degree of hydrolysis. It depends on the enzyme that you're using. Sometimes 8% hydrolysis could result in a high perception of bitterness. Sometimes 12% hydrolysis does not. You won't perceive bitterness because it depends on the enzyme used. But like a rule of thumb in general, between 8 and 10 and higher, you would have a perception of bitterness. So another way of controlling proteolysis or directing the production of certain peptides is the specificity of the enzymes that you choose. So different enzymes would have different specificity or regions that they would chop off your protein, and because of that you will end up having different profile of peptides. So some proteases, we call them as general proteases. That means they don't have a known specificity, so they would normally be peptidases. That means they would chop off peptides. Very low specificity. This you can can't control so much because it will just hydrolyze almost anything and won't result in a very characteristic profile for peptides. So the extent of hydrolysis and the type of the peptides generated will thus be controlled by the type and specificity of the enzyme. And here's an example which I showed you earlier for soy protein. So in this lane, for example, they've used pepsin enzyme. In this lane here, sorry, they used papain enzyme. So this is beta-lactoglobulins, beta-conglycinins, sorry. These are glycinins. So papain was effective in chopping off beta-conglycinins, so you don't see these banding. You see those smaller peptides down here. And the pepsin was specific for glycinin. So you see the beta-conglycinin intact, and then you see that the glycinin subunits are missing, and then you have those smaller peptides. So you can control the type of peptide generated by selecting the enzyme. So with that, this became a better gelling agent. This became a better emulsifying agent. So because we know that a glycinin is a better, forms a stronger gel, so once you hydrolyze it, you lose the gelation capability. And the same is true when you hydrolyze beta-conglycinin, you lose emulsification capability. So you can modify and promote a certain directed change based on what you know about the enzyme and the protein. So another example is what we're doing in the lab. We are working with an enzyme that we know will release hydrophilic peptides to enhance solubility of certain proteins. So if we know the enzyme background and we know the types of protein we're working on, we can select the enzyme for a targeted modification and functionality. So other ways to control hydrolysis is also, of course, time, temperature, and pH. We all know that you need optimum temperature and optimum pH to induce the enzymatic reaction. But sometimes if you want to control it, you don't want to run your reaction at the optimum temperature and the optimum pH. So you deviate from it to control how the percent hydrolysis and the types of peptides generated. For example, pH. If you change the pH a little bit, you will change the ionization of the protein and the ionization of the binding site of the enzyme or the active site of the enzyme. By doing so, you are manipulating its specificity. By doing so, you will end up having different profiles of peptides. So you can modify temperature and pH to change the course of hydrolysis. And the time is always something you can change to control the degree of hydrolysis. Because, you know, the longer you keep it, the more it's going to get hydrolyzed eventually. So time really, not necessarily a different profile per se, but rather more hydrolyzed protein you will generate. Of course, you will release shorter peptides in the process with longer time. Denaturation of the peptide. Here's an illustration of how denaturation of the protein impact hydrolysis. So you know that when the protein is partially unfolded, you're now exposing new binding sites. So the enzyme has access to more binding sites. So if the enzyme was specific originally, it might lose its specificity. So look at the same example up here is here. The only difference between here and here is we started with a denatured SPI. So here we started with a native SPI. That's our native SPI. And here it's denatured. You still see the same banding, obviously, because the way you prepare your sample, you actually use SDS, you denature it, and you reduce it. So you see the same banding. But before that, if you run DSC, this was completely denatured protein. This was still native protein. So same enzyme we used here. We used actually papain, and then here we used pepsin, if I remember correctly. So, but we don't see the differentiation anymore. Everything was hydrolyzed randomly. So we lost the specificity because the protein opened up and the enzyme was able to get into different binding sites that they were not able to access prior. So the state of the protein impact your profile, how the protein gets hydrolyzed. So this is a research we've done that we illustrated that you can actually use the specificity of the enzyme and impart a certain change without having to isolate a fraction and hydrolyze it individually. Okay, what do I mean? I'm talking gibberish, I think, to some of you. So let's, based on previous literature, we found that if you hydrolyze beta-conglysinin specifically, we will generate potent peptides that have physiological activity. In this case, we looked at antihypertensive activity. So potency, this is IC50, so this is the concentration at which you cause 50% inhibition of an antihypertensive enzyme in the body. So the smaller the number, the more potency. That means you need less protein to reach 50% inhibition. So from literature, we know that beta-conglysinin will release peptides that are more potent than glycinin. So some other researchers thought, okay, we isolate beta-conglysinin, we hydrolyze it, and we get our potent peptides. But this is not really feasible in industry. So you want to isolate soy protein and then go back and isolate beta-conglysinin and then hydrolyze, additional step. So can we eliminate fractionation of beta-conglysinin to generate potency or potent peptides? So we know from previous work that papain is specific to hydrolyze beta-conglysinin and pepsin will hydrolyze glycinin. So we know that. So we wanted to prove whether we fractionate or we leave the SPI as is, as a complete fraction, we'll get the same output. So we took SPI. So we got a beta-conglysinin fractionated, glycinin fractionated SPI, and we subjected to papain and pepsin hydrolysis. What we found out that whether we use the entire SPI or a fraction of the SPI, beta-conglysinin, we end up having the same potency, because in both cases papain targeted beta-conglysinin. So here's your SPI, papain is gone. Here's the beta-conglysinin, papain is gone. So in any, not papain, sorry, beta-conglysinin. Using papain in both cases, the beta-conglysinin banding was gone, and in the same situation, the glycinin was gone when pepsin was used, whether we used SPI or glycinin-rich fraction. So this proved that if we work with the specificity of the enzyme, we can eliminate additional steps that are not needed. We don't need to fractionate beta-conglysinin to get bioactive peptide. We can hydrolyze beta-conglysinin within a complex matrix and get the same results. So, mechanism for improved functionality. So these are general mechanism. So you can have increased solubility because theoretically, when you hydrolyze the protein, you are freeing ionizable groups, amine and carboxyl groups. So theoretically, you should have more interaction with water, you should enhance solubility. And also you will have smaller molecular weight peptides. So these will be potentially more soluble than larger proteins. And when you have more charges by freeing amine groups and carboxyl groups, because you're breaking peptide bonds, then you have better thermal stability because you have charges, then you won't have hydrophobic interactions. Depending on the protein and the peptide profile that has been released, you can also have improved gelation. You can also, when you break down the protein, change what's on the surface in terms of hydrophobic to hydrophilic balance, and therefore improve surface activity. But if you use one enzyme and one protein, you don't always improve everything, right? So it depends on the protein that you're working with. If you have a protein that is very hydrophilic on the surface, if you break it a little bit, then it becomes a better emulsifier. We've seen this with whey protein isolate. So when we hydrolyze whey protein isolate, a little bit, limited degree of hydrolysis, emulsification capacity and stability increases. Okay? Whereas solubility might not always increase, again, depending if we use the same enzyme. Trypsin, for example, is known to enhance emulsification capacity of whey protein. But if you hydrolyze whey protein with trypsin, solubility will be reduced. It will still be soluble, but it will be reduced if you heat it and if the protein concentration is high. So again, you cannot always enhance all functionality using the same protein and the same enzyme. So this is a project that was done also by one of my students, and in this project we did a valorization of delactosed whey. Do you know what delactosed whey is? Do you have, what, yeah.
Well, you can take the lactose out and use it as a food ingredient.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So you have this large amount of whey, and then you want to take out the lactose to use it as for lactose ingredient, then you end up with a product known as delactosed whey. So it is mostly used for animal feed, and it's really relatively high in mineral content, but you can reduce that by reverse osmosis and dialysis. And it does have the powder, the delactosed whey powder, does have a decent amount of protein. It's not as rich as whey protein concentrate or whey protein isolate, but it does have 24% protein. And that protein in there is still functional, still your regular whey protein isolate, whey protein components. They're still there. But if you want to formulate with it, you have only 24% protein versus an isolate that is 90% protein. So how can you add value to such product? So if we impart moderate hydrolysis to the protein within delactosed whey, we can amplify its functional characteristics and therefore add value to this product. So that was our initial hypothesis, is let's add value to this product, let's initiate hydrolysis and increase functionality. We wanted to target limited hydrolysis, and then we were stuck with, okay, now what enzyme should we use? What conditions should we use? And to get a desired targeted change. So there are a lot of conditions to choose from. So we went ahead and worked with a statistical design. You all like statistics now. Did you talk about RSM in statistics? No? Oh, that's strange. They used to in the past. Huh? Response surface methodology. They changed. Maybe they changed. Okay, in the past they did go over it, but anyway, response surface methodology, what it is you can have a design where you, instead of running full factorial design, for example, you have 4 independent variables, pH, temperature, time, and substrate to enzyme ratio, 4 variables. And you want 3 levels, so you would end up having 81 different hydrolysate that you want to produce times 3 for replication. 81 times 3 is 243, right? Yeah, so that's a lot of hydrolysates. No, Sonia said, don't come near me. No. With RSM, there are different types of designs that you can generate where it could be 24 experiments that you would do with different combinations of the factors and different replications. So instead of doing 81, you will end up doing 24 or 30 or 34, depending if you use plus or minus alpha. I'm not going to go into statistics, but in any case, you do much less combinations, and then you plot polynomial equations. You generate polynomial equations. We call them prediction equations. So based on the data that you collect, you generate equations, you plot it, and then you get the maxima of a plot. And that tells you that, okay, you have highest solubility. Let's say this is Y. You have highest solubility at a particular pH and temperature combination. And actually there would be time, but you cannot see a plot with 4 variables. Usually you have 2 slices within a plot. But anyway, you can get a polynomial equation that has time, temperature, pH, and substrate to enzyme ratio, that you can plug them in that equation and get you maximum solubility. So at which combination of these factors will give you maximum solubility? So you have a prediction equation. So this is really cool design to use. And this is what IDEM generated. Again, like I said, you can only look at 2 variables at one time and generate the surface response. So he did that for DH. So for DH, he determined at which combination you'll have the highest DH or which combination you have the lowest DH. And at the same time, this is an example, he looked at emulsification capacity, and also he looked at what combinations you will have the highest emulsification capacity. So here's his data. So we compared 2 controls, WPI as a control, delactosed whey, our starting material, and a protein concentrate, whey protein concentrate that is low concentration, 34. Very close to delactosed whey, but a little bit higher. So we looked at DH, EC, which is emulsification capacity, activity, and stability. And then the polynomial equations generated optimized conditions for EA, optimized conditions for EC. If you look at EA, this is optimized for the highest emulsification activity. It has higher emulsification activity even than WPI. And it has higher stability than all of the controls. And the emulsification capacity was comparable to WPI. The other one that was optimized for EC using papain was the one that had the best results with optimized conditions. We had very similar EC value. Emulsification activity was lower, but emulsification stability was higher. So using RSM, we were able to deduce conditions to get us optimized functionality. He used these conditions to generate hydrolyzed products and applied it in a meat product. So he formulated meat patties and supplemented meat patties with the different controls. And this control here means has nothing. There's WPI or WPC, delactosed whey, and the hydrolyzed whey. He found that the hydrolyzed delactosed whey using alkylase under optimized condition, you have the best compression force. That means the meat patty was together better. So it was held, it does not crumble when you apply force to it. Or it requires a lot of force compared to the other before it crumbles. So it was a nice finding that even with a product that is low in protein, you can actually use enzymatic hydrolysis and generate an optimized combination of conditions to impart a targeted functionality enhancement. Okay, the story is not always as sweet with hydrolysis. So this is another situation where we were aiming enhanced solubility, and this is before our discovery of another enzyme that we're hoping that will work better. But here we screened different enzymes: alkylase, fungal enzyme, bromelain from pineapple, papain from papaya, and trypsin digestive enzyme. And the solubility was, no matter what we use, it was reduced. Why? Yes, we are. And add to this, well, there are differences. It seems like when you hydrolyze with trypsin, remember when I told you trypsin had better emulsification in general, is used to enhance emulsification properties because it probably enhances the hydrophilic balance, but it would reduce solubility. So different enzyme resulted in a different peptides profile. Some were more hydrophobic than others. So, but we weren't able to enhance solubility in any of them. There's another, other than the differences among them is due to the type of peptides generated. There's another thing in this question that would lead to an answer. Boiled. So it seems like even a hydrolysate that you would theoretically have smaller peptides, more amine, more carboxyl groups, you're heating, it's going to aggregate. So this is a protein prior to a hydrolysis. This is protein after enzymatic hydrolysis. When we heat, they're going to aggregate because now we're exposing the interior hydrophobic moiety of the protein. You are probably releasing what we call aggregate promoters, peptides. Some peptides that act as a glue and promote aggregation due to the fact that either you expose a sulfider group or you have released a peptide that is very hydrophobic that acts as a glue between the different peptides and intact proteins. So in protein hydrolysate, we do have processing challenge, and that is mostly attributed to the aggregation that is induced by heat and moisture. So heat, you're going to get aggregates. You'll end up having irreversible interactions. You could have disulfide linkages, or you can have protein carbohydrate interactions, and then that would be a Maillard, advanced stage of a Maillard reaction that would result in protein polymerization. And then by doing so, you could lose bioactivity of the peptides if you generated bioactive peptide, and not just that, lose solubility. So there are several factors that lead to protein aggregation. We say intrinsic factors, the makeup of the protein, is it high in hydrophobic residues or low in hydrophobic residues, the temperature at which the protein denatures, the extrinsic factors such as the pH of the system, the ionic strength of the system, the humidity, and then of course hydrolysis, the release of peptides that are aggregate promoters, and if you have reducing sugars, you end up with protein polymerization due to Maillard reaction, so you end up with aggregation. So why is this a challenge, and what it impacts. So if we look at it from an industrial point of view, not just from the chemistry of it, so it really impacts huge market places. So you have the baby formula, which is a huge market, 4 billion market. Nutrition bars, 3 billion market. And then the functional beverage market has been growing over the years to reach 20 billion value of 20 billion. So the aggregation impacts all these sectors, which is a major challenge. So in baby formulas, you end up having caking, so you lose quality that way. With caking, you reduce solubility, so you put that formula in water, shake it, doesn't go into solution like you want it to. Hardening of nutrition bar, so chew on a bar that has high protein, it will harden over time due to the aggregation over time. And then loss of clarity in beverages over time. So you can, a high protein beverage might not be shelf stable more than 4 weeks. So which is something that is a problem, to have a very short shelf life. The beverage, that was Maillard reaction, yeah. Yeah, that was, having some reducing sugar in there, the high fructose corn syrup and protein. Okay, so the aggregation obviously reduces shelf life and you end up with economic loss. So what do? Limit aggregation by modification of the protein. So if we look at the dry and semi-moist foods like the powders and the nutrition bars, so you have thermal treatment that needs to be done that would lead to denaturation. So protein is opened up, now it's ready to interact with other proteins. And then of course you have moisture, and then you heat during transport and storage. So moisture, heat, denatured protein equal aggregation. And this is due to hydrophobic, disulfide, and polymerization due to Maillard if you have reducing sugar. In a beverage, you have, again, you heat the beverage, you get denaturation. pH. So depending on the pH of the system, some proteins are more stable at acidic pH, others are more stable at neutral pH. Presence of salt, of course, the type of the protein, and protein concentration. You might develop a stable protein beverage at 1% protein, but really, can you make a claim as high protein beverage with 1%? No. They want more. You need at least 4.2% of protein to make a high protein beverage. So, but with higher protein concentration, higher chances of interactions once the protein is denatured. This is work done by another student of mine looking at soy protein and aggregation when stored as dry powder over time. So what she did, she stored her SPI at different humidity levels for up to 77 days. And she stored similarly a hydrolyzed soy protein and a combination of SPI and SPH together, a powder that is a combination of both. So if you can see here, the original, we started with a native protein. So it was very, very soluble. Over time and at higher moisture, you end up having a caking and aggregates. So you see a drastic decrease from 100% way down to 20%. Okay, granted, if it's hydrolyzed, it lost solubility, but it was, you don't see this drastic reduction in solubility in a hydrolyzed product than in an intact product. And the combination was a combination in between these two observations. So it seemed like a hydrolyzed product, although it lost solubility initially, it meant it was more stable across different humidity levels than intact SPI. The same when she looked at 3 time points where you see a drastic drop for SPI. For example, if you look at 0.59, over time it goes from almost 70 down to 25 or 25% soluble, whereas the SPH maintained similar solubility over time. I'm going to skip this one for time. This was looking at bioactivity. Bioactivity was not impacted by storage. Okay. Moving on to a beverage problem. So we have the powder aggregation, but also you have industrial problem related to beverages. So you all know by now that whey protein is the protein for beverage application. But still, if you talk to people from Davisco who changed now, they're no longer Davisco. I can't remember the names. But they still want research done to enhance thermal stability of whey protein beverages and storage stability and increase the shelf life, increase protein content, and increase the shelf life of these beverages. So although whey protein is excellent, the golden standard for solubility, it still has challenges. Why is that? Because it's heat labile. You pasteurize those beverages, the protein is denatured. You have 5% protein in the beverage and they're denatured, put it on the shelf, there's time where it is going to come together and aggregate. High concentration, denatured protein sitting on the shelf, it will aggregate and you will have a short shelf life. So here's the illustration. So you have the beta-lactoglobulin, main whey protein, heat, denatures, you open up the structure, you have the hydrophobic components, free sulfider group, they're going to have hydrophobic interaction, disulfide linkages, aggregate and precipitate over time. So when you heat the beverage, you might not see instantaneous precipitation, it's still in solution, but give it time, those proteins are going to interact. So you have short shelf life. So there are 2 types of beverages that are present in the market for whey protein beverages or any other type of protein beverages. You have the neutral, and if you're using whey protein, it's generally opaque, it's not clear, so you have it covered either a chocolate type of beverage or strawberry, orange cream, so you have that color beverage. Most fruit-flavored beverages are acidic and whey protein is clear. These are desirable. There is a desire for clear beverages in the market. So whey protein forms a clear beverage. So, however, to get it to be clear, you have to reduce the pH quite a bit. So if you have a pH between 3.5 and 5.5, your whey proteins are in octamers. So they are turbid. So you don't have a clear beverage. They're soluble aggregates, but turbid, creamy in appearance. And you have maximum buffering capacity when you have it close to the pI as such. So you really need to drop the pH more in order to get to that clear point. To do that, you have to add quite a bit of acid because proteins are buffers. And the higher concentration protein you have in your beverage, the more acid you need to lower that pH. So if you have 1% protein or 5% protein, the 5% protein you need to add more acid to get to pH 3.4 or 3.2. So what ends up happening is you have a really sour beverage and astringent beverage. So now what? That's another problem that they're facing. So it's not just thermal stability and shelf life, there's also the flavor. You cannot go beyond a certain point and maintain a good flavor. So what the solution is, a lot of people have looked at improving solubility by hydrolysis. Okay, in order to do that, they had to increase the degree of hydrolysis beyond 10% to achieve this. But with that comes flavor changes, bitterness. Add to the bitterness, you become better buffer. because now you're releasing carboxyl groups and amine groups. So you have more buffering capacity. So more acid to add to reduce the pH. So more sourness, more astringency. That is not a solution. And also they found that over storage you still get those disulfide linkages, the hydrophobic interaction, the precipitation over time. So really this did not solve the problem or enhance shelf life or reduce sourness or astringency. This is the famous research. Glycation. So far, research-wise, this is promising. Industry-wise, we're not there yet. Okay, so but research has shown that if you initiate Maillard reaction and stop it at the Amadori compound formation, you end up with a glycated product, a protein with carbohydrate of a moderate chain length linked to it. With that, you have enhanced solubility and thermostability. So the Maillard reaction, as you know, is a reducing sugar. The carbonyl carbon of a reducing sugar react with the reactive amine group. Usually it's your primary amine, such as a terminal amine or an amine group from a lysine. And then you form a Schiff base, and then rearrangement, you get the Amadori compound, which is a glycated protein. So this is your wonderful Maillard reaction that you all are too familiar with, and you know it by heart. No. Okay, so you have the initial stage, and then these you end up, we call it intermediate stage, but there's a chain of reactions, but they all bulk it in an intermediate stage where you have intermediate products, and then a series of polymerization and additional reaction, you get advanced glycation end products, AGEs. So, and these are polymerized proteins, mutagenic, brown color, off flavor, all that sort. So you don't really want any of that. You don't want the intermediate stage, because if the protein reaches intermediate stage, a little bit of heat, and then you push it to advanced stage. So you don't want to get there. You want just the initial stage where you get the Amadori rearrangement and you have the glycated protein. You don't want intermediate stage, and obviously you don't want final stage where you have mutagenic compounds, off flavors, browning, poor water protein solubility due to polymerization, nutritional loss due to large polymer, reduced digestibility, and blockage of lysine. And of course, even more shorter shelf life. So no, you don't want that. So how do we do that without getting to advanced stages? How do we glycate the protein without getting it to advanced stages? So in order to do that, there are certain conditions you need to control. So you want to promote the reaction, but you don't want the rate of the reaction to be fast. Okay? So you want glycation to occur, but the rate of the Maillard reaction needs to be very slow, so you are in control and you can stop it at the initial stage. So research so far that has been successful was done under dry heating conditions, since temperature is another factor that increases the rate of the reaction. So if you do it under reduced temperature and water activity, which is you're limiting the moisture, it's below the optimum of Maillard reaction. If you maintain it below an optimum range, and also you maintain a temperature that's not too high, because again temperature impacts the rate, at the same time temperature denatures the protein, so you don't want high temperature. So if you maintain temperature below denaturation, water activity below optimum, and use saccharides that are not high reducing or not high in reducing capability. So instead of using lactose, maltose, glucose, you end up using maltodextrin, for example. Maltodextrin is portions of starch that has been hydrolyzed to a certain molecular weight. And you want to make it partial. That means you don't want to glycate every possible site on your protein. Because if you glycate every possible site, you lose lysine. and lysine is an essential amino acid. So you want to maintain partial glycation so that you have a physicochemical change, but you don't lose nutritional value. So the physicochemical changes that occur with glycation based on the research we've done, we found out that the negative charge increased. Why is that? Because glycation occurs at an amine group. So you are potentially blocking a positive charge. By doing so, you are increasing the net negative charge on the surface. And when you have higher net negative charge on the surface, you have higher hydrophilicity on the surface. Add to that, when you have negative charges on the surface, you increase the denaturation temperature. It becomes more thermally stable. With more charges, more interaction with the water, the protein doesn't want to expose its hydrophobic groups, so it won't denature as readily as a protein with less charge on the surface. With that, since you have less denaturation, less disulfide interchange because the SH group is hidden within the protein. And then, in addition to that, is the steric hindrance due to bulky polysaccharides. Steric hindrance, that means they're bulky, they don't want to come together. They just like, it's bulky, I don't want to be close to that. So you have overall increased salivation, and with increased salivation, you have repulsion, you don't have as much protein-protein interaction. So the protein does not denature readily, you have net negative charges, you have bulky groups, the proteins do not interact. So that's the theory behind that. And we proved it experimentally when we looked at whey protein and glycated. This should read glycated, not glycosylated. So glycated whey protein. Look at the heated at pH 4.5 and 5.5. So the whey protein that is not modified, it drops out of solution. Solubility goes from 100% almost to 5 to 7%. Whereas the glycated protein remains 90% or higher at all pHs, 7, 3.4, 4.5, it's the isoelectric point of whey protein. Remember, when you heat the whey protein, it goes down at the isoelectric point? It didn't here. So the protein became soluble over a wide range of pH. Now, why pH 4.45 is very exciting for industry? Is it still considered acidic beverage? It's less than 4.6. So you can still pasteurize as if it is acidic beverage. So you don't have to do high thermal treatment. So you can still have a low thermal treatment to get rid of pathogenic bacteria. It's still considered acidic. Your protein is soluble and clear. And with 4.5 compared to 3.4, you need less acid. So it will be less acidic and less astringent. So you can increase the protein concentration. It stays clear at higher pHs, and flavor-wise, it won't be as adverse. So that's much better than a hydrolysate, don't you think? Yeah. So we proved that denaturation temperature became about 15 degrees higher. So instead of denaturing at 71 degrees, it denatured at 87 degrees Celsius. So it became more thermally stable. And then we looked at surface hydrophobicity. The protein that is native, not modified, you see an increase in surface hydrophobicity with heat. And then due to polymerization, the surface hydrophobicity decreases. Whereas the glycated protein increase, you do get some partial unfolding, but then it stays much lower than the native non-modified one. So that means the protein did not open up. Even when you heat and for extended period of time, it resists complete denaturation. And then looking at heating for several intervals of time, you can see that you lose monomers and you end up having polymerization at the top, whereas the glycated one, it remains as monomers with heat. So it did not polymerize, it did not open up, solubility remained perfect. So this indicates also that it will be shelf stable for a longer period of time because the protein did not denature. Looking at Raman spectroscopy, we looked at, okay, what happened? The structure didn't even change with heat. So the glycated protein versus non-glycated protein, no heat and heat. You can see whey protein isolate, you can see the structure, the spectra changes dramatically when you heat it at different pHs. But when you heat the partially glycated whey protein, you compare the spectra of non-heated to heated at all pHs. It stays the same. This gives you structural rigidity. This proves that the protein resisted structural change. So this is relating structure to function. So we're looking that structure was maintained. That's why solubility was enhanced, even with heating. So I just want to add that, again, there is not one shoe that fits all, right? So every protein is different. The type of carbohydrate you use is different, and the glycation conditions will be different. So depending on the type of protein, the type of carbohydrate, the glycation conditions, you'll end up with a series of different enhanced functionality. So in one case, you can enhance solubility. In another case, you enhance emulsification. In another case, you enhance gelation. So it all depends on the starting protein, the type of carbohydrate, and the extent of glycation conditions. Then you end up with different benefits. So here's how we do it in the lab. In the lab, this is actually work done by another student of mine, but instead of doing whey protein isolate, she did whey protein hydrolysate. So we want the bioactivity of whey protein hydrolysate, and we want it to be more soluble. So we started with the bioactive product we got from Davisco. It's bioactive, it has high antihypertensive activity, but it's, again, a problem with solubility. So we said, let's glycate that product and see if we can maintain bioactivity and improve solubility. So what she did was she mixed her protein with dextran. We use dextran, which is a microbial type of carbohydrate. And then she mixed them together at a particular ratio. And what she did is she incubated using salt solutions that gives you a water activity below 0.5. And she, yeah, nice animation, not by me, by her. She put that at a particular temperature, 60 degrees. Oh, look at that, it's going on its own. And she pulled out samples at different time points. The reason we do different time points is we want to determine at which time point we get decent amount of glycation, no browning, no advanced stages Maillard reaction. And actually, this is another student of mine that worked collaboratively with the other student and worked on separating non-reactive sugars from the glycated protein, because you want to keep an isolate, right? You want to keep a high protein concentration product. Oh, it's working on its own. So you want to remove all carbohydrate that did not react, and you